For our authors, but don't want to appear on camera. That's great. You can just type your question in the chat box and Rachel and I will pose it. If you don't mind or would like to appear on camera and recorded for posterity onto YouTube, that's fine too. It only records the part that's speaking in the little yellow box that I'm in, whoever's speaking like that. So we can easily let you in. Rachel, take things away.
We're incredibly grateful for all of our customers' ongoing support of Northshire in this time of real crisis for small local businesses. A friendly reminder, please shop early and shop local, not just us, but your other favorite local businesses throughout this holiday season. The ABA is saying October is the new December, and shopping early really does help your favorite independent businesses. Tonight's guest author is going to be interviewed by Jeff Goodell, a longtime friend of the Northshire. Jeff is a contributing editor at Rolling Stone and the author of books including How to Cool the Planet, which won the 2011 Grantham Prize Award of Special Merit, and Sunnyvale, a memoir about growing up in Silicon Valley, which was a New York Times notable book. Northshire Saratoga store and yours truly were lucky enough to host the launch of his remarkable book, The Water Will Come, back in 2017. Our guest author this evening is Lee Vandervoo, an award-winning investigative and environmental journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and The Guardian, among others. Her 2016 book, The Fish Market, which chronicles the gentrification of the sea in the name of sustainable seafood, won an Oregon Book Award for general nonfiction. She's joining us tonight to celebrate the release of her new book, As the World Burns. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you. Appreciate that nice introduction. This is As the World Burns. In this book, I started it a couple years ago in preparation for what I thought would be one of the most important trials in America, and it was the trial of 21 young people who were suing the federal government over climate change, charging that the government's subsidizing, authorizing, and permitting a fossil fuel energy system essentially deprived them of their constitutional rights to life, to property, and liberty. Their case, it was interesting. It was an interesting journey. In early days, I think a lot of people dismissed it as a kind of media ploy. 21 kids suing the government over climate change. Very unique. Is it for real? Is it just a publicity stunt? Are they being stage managed by hand-wringing parents, or are they props to a legal nonprofit? I was very curious about these things, and I wanted to know, as their trial got closer and closer and seemed to be more of a real thing, I and a lot of other people started to take this case very seriously and began to see it as a critical, very, very important trial for our country. Now, in my mind, it's the most important trial for America that never happened. In the summer of 2018, I started interviewing these plaintiffs in the places where they lived, meeting their families, and trying to understand what brought them to the cause of climate change and what encouraged them to try to sue the government. I moved to Springfield, Oregon, in preparation of covering their trial, thinking, this is a Ninth Circuit case. It took place in Eugene, Oregon, and the district court scheduled to go to trial in October of 2018, and 11 days before it was supposed to go to trial, it was canceled. And there's a lot of detail in the book about exactly how, but I'll summarize by saying that the Trump administration deployed pretty rare legal tactics in this case and other cases really close to the president's agenda. So DACA, Muslim travel ban, just to name a couple, in essentially stymieing the case. Using a stacked Supreme Court to pressure lower courts, basically. And so instead of having a trial, the plaintiffs and their attorneys and some experts who had traveled to trial in Oregon had a rally on the courthouse steps instead. And I was living in the woods with a hefty cat named Larry and a couple of very mean raccoons, and realizing that this trial was not going to happen, that I was suddenly unemployed, no plans. And so I started just kind of following the plaintiffs through the fallout of this, through the fall of 2018 into winter in 2019, and up until for a full year. And during that time, our nation saw some of the worst natural disasters in its history, keynote being, the decimation of Paradise, California, and the Camp Fire. It was a record year in all kinds of ways, disaster-wise. It also was a really interesting political year where we were watching Congress fight for power, essentially, with the president in a very consequential election. And of course, 2018 was the year that we learned from the IPCC, which is the UN's climate panel, that we have 12 years or bust to do something about climate change, to avert basically climate breakdown. So watching that play out with a group of young people was a very interesting time, and it became this book. And it's about more than the case. It's about the view that young people have of basically adult inaction, denial, abdication of responsibility in addressing the climate crisis that they find so urgent. So they're a very unique group. People always ask me to describe them, and I always say that, you kind of can't. They're not one bunch. They're very individual, but to say a few things about them, they ranged in age in early days when the case was filed, so 2015, from 8 years old to 19. They're now 13 to 24. They come from all over the United States. 6 are indigenous, half are people of color. About 10 are from the state of Oregon, and they are litigating essentially wildfire threats to their farms, drought conditions. Others are from Alaska, litigating the loss of an Arctic lifestyle. There are 2 plaintiffs whose homes are threatened by sea level rise in communities. One was adopted from the Marshall Islands. The other lives on a barrier island off the coast of Florida. One is Navajo and has been living on the Navajo Nation in conditions of severe drought. So I want to read for just a couple of minutes a sample of one of these young person stories, young plaintiff stories, and then we'll chat a bit. This is Jaden Foytlin. Jaden is, at the time of this interview, 15 years old. She lives in southern Louisiana. And that's a place where there's been, of course, more storms and heavy rainfall. So here's a bit about Jaden. In the morning, I'd first encountered Jaden in her bedroom, purple, after I found my way down a dark hall of her pink house. Jaden's older sister, Erin, a few minutes awake, was flopped on the bed under a pastel comforter, and Jaden was at her desk, the wall above it covered in watercolors and drawings. Jaden was friendly and talked about her activism and her art and her love for aeronautics, told me how captivated she is by planets and how she hopes to one day study science. She said the planets that used to adorn her room were still put away. The reference was to flooding that figured large in her pleadings. So I asked Jaden to tell me about the floods, especially the flood in 2016, and her expression darkened. Here's what she said. I woke up at like 3, somewhere in the AM, because my older sisters Erin and Grace were knocking on my door and telling me to wake up, and that water was coming through the house. Of course, I thought I was dreaming because I was like, why the hell would water be coming through? I was kind of thinking, what do they want? I thought they were just trying to make me come out of my bed with some excuse or something. They weren't. Jaden sat up. She swung her legs to the floor and stepped into water up to her ankles. The house was a ranch on a slab, an L-shaped building with the longest length reaching deep into the backyard. Jaden was at the end of this stretch, in a room with a door to the yard, and outside it was raining hard. She walked toward her sister's voices in the hallway, opened the door to find them there, and as she did this, pulled the door toward her, water rushed from her room into the rest of her home. I was like, oh, that's my fault. Oh my God, why did I open the door? She said. Elsewhere, water had been rising through the cracks in the foundation, soaking the carpeting. Sewage and old water rose in the toilets and in the bathtubs, but until then, most of it was in Jaden's bedroom with Jaden, slowly leaking in from under the door. The sewage had the worst smell in the world. It was so nasty, she said. My family ended up getting sick. A lot of my neighbors ended up getting sick. Jaden's brother Dylan, her sister Grace, and Grace's boyfriend went to the police station, but no one could help them much. Just gave them a few sandbags to block the doors while the water rose. It wasn't enough. So next they used all the blankets, then the towels. So much water, they were no match for it. They gave up and focused on the electronics, on unplugging everything, worried about electrocution, and trying to save what could be saved. Drawings and photos were lost anyway. Jaden's bed frame dissolved in the lake of her room. Her brother's toys were next. When I asked her how high the water rose, she pointed to a watermark on the wall about 2 feet above the floor. I hate that flood so much, she said. This is a disaster that many people in America are not that familiar with, but it actually is considered the nation's worst natural disaster since Sandy, or what did at the time in 2016. It dumped more than 7 trillion gallons of water on Louisiana, which, to put that in perspective of how much rain that really is, it's more than 3 times the rainfall of Katrina. So this kind of increasing torrential rainfall is a problem for Louisiana increasingly, and increasing intensity of tropical storms is a problem for the whole Gulf area and South Coast. So just to put some things in perspective about what this looks like to young people, if you're 15 years old, as Jaden was at this time, you've been alive for 9 of 10 of the hottest years on record. If you're 22, you've seen all 10. And in the years between 2010 and 2020, the United States has seen increasingly dramatic and frequent natural disasters, especially since 2013. So if you've lived through that, say you're 7 years old, you've experienced the natural world as an unending cycle of unpredictable violence. And young people want a solution to this, and they look to adults to help help them fix it. And they are increasingly looking at older Americans, sadly, some of them, as being kind of this inaction being a wanton disregard for an imminent threat to their lives. It's very sad, it's upsetting, it's very anxiety provoking, and yet they come to it with a lot of hope, with good education and solutions in mind. I found this to be a really inspiring group of people and an inspiring story to tell, but an important one too, because I think, this is the affected generation. They are speaking to us through this case and through a lot of their other actions, and I think we should be listening to them. So I'll stop there and see if Jeff has some questions for me.
Well, Lee, that was great. That was a great reading also. That was a really got to one of the best parts of the book, I thought, which is the sort of intimacy with these kids' lives and the sense, the feeling of kind of what they're going through and the immensity of the challenge that they took on. One thing that, when you were just talking, that I immediately, being a journalist, wanted to ask you about is you called this the most important trial that ever happened, maybe. And I think I'm not even sure I disagree, but I wondered if you could frame it explain that, what you mean by that, and frame what was really going on here and why this trial was so important.
Yeah, sure. So what these plaintiffs are seeking in this case is they're seeking a climate remediation plan. So essentially what they want the federal government to take stock of its own carbon footprint and to create a path for how it will not only reduce its carbon use year to year, but draw down carbon existing in the atmosphere to safe levels. The United States has conceded in this case that it is responsible for 25% of the historic carbon in the atmosphere. And the United States continues to be responsible for a very large share of carbon, also as a global leader in many of these international agreements that could cause the world to turn its eye toward climate remediation. That is absolutely essential to the creating a livable planet, having a livable planet that makes life safe for young people and future generations going forward. That, I think, for me, I find that to be incredibly consequential litigation, and it's yet to see trial, so still waiting. Was dismissed by the Ninth Circuit in the early part of this year and is now pending on appeal.
Right, right. So, I mean, writing books is always hard, and you know, every book is hard in its own way, and every book is a plunge into, you know, some kind of unknown, but this strikes me as a particularly kind of interesting and bold move on your part, because you didn't know how this was going to end. You were chronicling this sort of in real time, right? I mean, it wasn't like this case happened, this whole drama played out, and then you went back and wrote about it. You were writing about it in real time, and you feel that in the book. The book has this drama of, like, you know, waiting and of like what's going on, and the world is, the great title, the world is burning while the courts are dithering, and all these legal obstructions go on. But what was it like for you as a writer writing a book about something like this, where the ending could have gone in so many different directions, and it could have gone on, and it may well still go on for years? How did you think about that?
You know, I kind of changed my perspective a lot. I mean, when the trial was canceled, I felt almost like a sense of outrage. It's just really interesting. I mean, I've been a journalist for 20 years. It's really hard to get worked up about anything in this business. I mean, there's always things going on. But at this point, like, just seeing, you know, 21 kids on the front steps of the courthouse clamoring about like why they didn't get to go inside and have their day in court really struck me as so antithetical to our systems that, you know, I had a lot I had a strong reaction to it, and I just kind of wanted to really stick with it. And I started doing a bit of writing that I showed to my agent early on, and she encouraged me to keep going. And you know, and kind of thinking about what sort of narrative is this. There were often times where I thought about it, it was like, well, it's like the Bad News Bears, or it's like a sports movie where the characters are losing in the beginning, but something will happen in the end. And the longer I got through it, the more I realized that that's not the narrative at all. Like, it's a tragedy, and it's about waiting. Like, the book is really, even though it does have a brisk pace, it is about waiting and the pain of that for young people, and just their perspective on what it looks like, I felt was so important. And I started to think of the waiting as kind of a canvas, if you will. It almost didn't matter to the book what happened in the trial. What mattered most was just the sound of these voices kind of coming across that, if you can think of it as the illustration, what these youth really had to say. And I tried to, in that journey, just grab onto the quotes that most galled me or impacted me, like the day when I was standing with Jacob LaBelle on his farm by the greenhouse, and he said, yeah, science doesn't tell us whether we should save the planet or not. It just tells us what is. I just thought, you know, oh my gosh, like, to think like that a young person is like wrestling with that question, whether we should even think about saving the planet. Those were the things that kind of came forward for me, and that was the story that I tried to tell. It was more a story of feeling than a narrative in time. That mattered less and less as I kept going.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, I mean, in the whole climate thing, waiting is the meta story. I mean, it really is. It's like, we've known about, you know, this for 40 years and basically have done nothing. And, you know, where is that going to take us, right? What kind of world is that waiting creating? And obviously the kids are the star of the show, and I want to ask you about them, but I also want to ask you about yourself. And, you know, one of the interesting things I felt in the book was you're kind of recalibrating your relationship with them. You're recalibrating your relationship with your own generations, our generation's responsibility for this. There's a couple of moments in the book where your kind of frustration and anger break through, like when you kind of buttonhole Ryan Zinke in outside of Paradise after the fires there. Talk a little bit about your own kind of journey as you were writing this book in watching what these kids were doing, watching them be so heroic and watching them come to understand what's at stake for them.
Well, I had never experienced climate change through their perspective. I mean, to me, it had been, and I explore this a bit in the book, but just like always a consumer movement. The way that it had been framed for me within history and the time that I entered the world, it was kind of like, you know, during the Cold War, where there had been a previous discussion about climate change and nuclear was a solution, and we got sort of trapped in that discussion. So I kind of grew up with this, like, you know, diving under your desk if somebody presses the button, or what, that was the threat to the world. I never experienced climate change as the threat to the world the way that these young people have. And I just thought, like, I think a lot of adults think in America that if you're making the right decisions at the cash register, you're warding off climate change somehow. And we need much, much more than that. And I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't have a very good perspective of that. Experiencing that learning with them was a really impactful experience for me. And I think, you know, as I say, it is very hard after 20 years of journalism to get super worked up about anything. You know, I think a lot of journalists have like kind of a Dadaist philosophy where you're just going along and things happen and you're observing and writing it down, but it's all not really of consequence at a certain point. But I think when you're dealing with young people, especially people who really, I mean, have very few avenues to advocate for themselves, honestly, you know, there's like where you have to be, instead of the journalist, the adult in the room. And I find myself more becoming the adult in the room in this process and becoming the narrative through line for a trial that wasn't happening. So I just put those things together at a point, and hopefully to some decent effect.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's really powerful. Another thing that I think that is interesting about the book is that, you know, here we are, you know, hopefully near the end of Donald Trump's presidency, and we see the climate fight through the lens of Trump and you know, it's all a hoax, and his dismantling of the EPA and all the obvious things that he has been doing as, you know, an enemy of climate change. But this story really began under Obama, and in a very different culture, and a very different time, and a very different kind of political dynamic than we have today. Talk a little bit about that, because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, sure. So the case was filed against the Obama administration, which I think is one of its strengths, really. I mean, aside from the fact that it was filed by a group of children, the fact that it was filed against a blue president kind of really just, it takes it out of this polarizing political dynamic that we're all in. So in early days, the Obama administration did fight the litigation as any, you know, government will defend itself. But what was really interesting about it was that the fossil fuel industry applied for and got standing in the case. So that meant that some of the largest trade associations for like the Exxon Mobils of the world and Chevron, Sunoco, got standing in this case and were litigating it on behalf of the industry. So there were several years of, I'm just trying to think of the timeline here, very aggressive litigation, I guess in the first like really 14, 15 months of the case, really pushing back against essentially just trying to have it thrown out of the court. And interestingly, the American Manufacturers Association was involved as well. I assume because of its relationship to like plastics, which are fossil fuel based. But, you know, the Obama administration didn't do too much. A lot of the fight then became with the fossil fuel industry trying to kick these kids out of court. And what happened were two things. You know, of course, Trump was elected, and that kind of coincided with a stand down, if you will, of industry in the case. The other thing that was happening was that the industry was it was about to be subject to discovery, which meant that, okay, if you're going to be in this case, you have to start turning over documents. And that was not palatable for folks. So that changed. Industry left the case. The other significant development was that the Trump administration appointed as head of the economic section of, or sorry, the environmental section of the Department of Justice, a former BP attorney whose entire early career was settling Deepwater Horizon claims for the oil spill in the Gulf. So, you know, this man could be counted on to defend industry. And there was little concern that if industry left the case, that they wouldn't be represented. That's my assumption, I should say. That's not on record, but one can assume. So,
well, I mean, you know, it's no surprise that all that happened under Trump, but I mean, how would you grade or critique the way the Obama administration handled this? I mean, could they have done more to, you know, accelerate this case? How did they handle it in your view?
You know, the Obama administration did not pave the way for these kids to go to court. That's for sure. You know, they fought it just as aggressively, and you know, it was the Obama administration that made the United States like a top exporter of LNG, natural gas, and oil. So, you know, let's not forget that Obama presided over an enormous expansion of fossil fuel production in this company. So, you know, that administration had a stake in the case as well. What I will say is that the 11th hour, right before Trump assumed office, the one thing that the government did do was cede in the trial proceedings that the United States is responsible for 25% of carbon dioxide accumulation throughout the course of history. So that's significant, and that stuck.
Right. And I should say, just for clarity's sake, Obama did do a lot of really good things on climate, especially in his second term, that were really important and significant, and, you know, could have been built upon had we had a different result in 2016, or at least not gone backwards. And now, of course, we're in the predicament of having to rebuild a lot of things that were, you know, a lot of progress that was made under Obama, everything from, you know, clean car standards to building codes and all kinds of things. But Obama was not, you know, I only brought this up because I think it's easy during Trump to think that this is all a problem of Trump, and it's really not. This has been a political problem for 40 years under every administration. And I think that dynamic is changing now. And I think that, you know, this is partly because of kids like the ones that you wrote about. In cases like this, it's gaining a kind of political force that it hasn't had ever before. And it certainly, you know, has a kind of political prominence that it hasn't before, although we'll see what actually happens. But you know, I want to talk about another thing that's different about your book that I think, in the sense of setting the stage, is or the context of the story, is this was also, these kids were pre-Greta, right? Right? I mean, everybody knows who Greta Thunberg is now, and she became the voice of youth activists around the world, and really galvanized a movement that the kids that you're writing about kind of started, right? Or at least were leaders of before Greta. Talk about you know, what Greta has done for this movement, and how, you know, these kids that you wrote about thought about her or think about her.
Well, I think Fridays for Future is brilliant, and there's a reason why, you know, Greta was catapulted to fame and infamy, and it's not only for her clear-eyed speaking, but also for the campaign of striking from school. Is, you know, if you want the adults to have to sit up and pay attention, stop going to school. That's a really good way to do it. And so, you know, bringing that campaign around the world is of course, essential to the movement, and so important. And I think had we not had a pandemic, the trajectory of where all that was headed this summer would have been just absolutely amazing. And it's unfortunate that it didn't happen. But the plaintiffs, were indeed pre-Greta. Kelsey Juliana, who's the lead plaintiff, walked across the country in support of climate remediation when she was, I think, 10 years old. She's 24 now. So she might have been a couple years older than that, but it was not in incredibly, recent time. So some of the folks have been in the fight a long time, and I think Tescott Martinez, who's a co-plaintiff, would talk about Indigenous youth and their kind of religious and cultural identity with advocating for the planet. He's been an active speaker about carbon emissions since he was like 6 years old, and I think he's 19 now, maybe just turned 20. So these kids have been in it for a very long time, and I think they have a lot of respect for Greta, and they do have personal relationships. And Greta, I think, has expressed that she was inspired by Tescott, and also one of the state level plaintiffs, Jamie Margolin, who brought a climate case against the state of Washington, and went on to found 0 Hour, which led the first climate march in Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of cross-pollinating in this group, and I think the one thing that I will say that the plaintiffs have expressed some frustration with is this sort of like revisionist history where everybody was inspired by Greta, and this whole thing started with Greta. For them, it's been a long journey.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just, you brought this up earlier, but I mean, it's just amazing that these kids, I mean, what, Levy was 9?
Levi Draheim, 8 years old when he started.
I mean, that's unbelievable, right? And so someone like him has grown up. I mean, not only grown up, I mean, passed through adolescence, through, basically gone from teddy bears to climate crisis. I mean, it's amazing, right, to think about that. What has it been like for him, or whoever else you want to talk about, in just the sort of psychological dynamics of this? I mean, I'm a father of 3 kids, and I just can't imagine what it at once giving them a great purpose, a great, moral values, fighting for something. I can imagine how great that is. On the other hand, I can imagine having the weight of the world on you in this way at that age, the political kind of pressure of being in the spotlight. I mean, you talk a lot about the media, and many of them have been media sensations. I mean, what has this been like for them?
I think that we won't know for some time what the total impact of this experience will be. I mean, I think they'll be into adulthood, some of them, before they can really look back and tell us that. But, I mean, it is a really intense and strange experience that they're having. I mean, you mentioned Levi being so young. When I asked him about what it was like for him to have the trial canceled, he described one of his most awful moments, having to go back to Florida and pick up his pet hermit crab from the pet sitter and explain to her, that his trial had been, like, that was really terrible for him. And you think about that, like, he is a kid, he is a very little kid. He's 13 now, but he's still very young. And yet an expert speaker who presents on NPR with Terry Gross, like, beautifully, so it's this strange experience where, on the one hand, and he will say that he loves the attention and he loves feeling like his voice matters and people are listening to him, and he has an opportunity to speak about something that he feels so passionately about as the youngest plaintiff. But then, I also hear from the older plaintiffs that, a lot of childhood was missed. Tescott talks very openly about that. There's a great speech that he gave in front of the Supreme Court last year, where, he talks about his little sister and how he sees her, doing her art projects and playing with her kittens, and really hopes that she won't have to come into the work like him, that she can just have that. That's very sad, So I think it's a pile of mixed blessings and a lot of stress.
I bet. And what was it like for you in the sense of, did you ever feel like you were trying, I mean, you're an adult, obviously. They're kids, they're going through this. I mean, was there ever a kind of feeling protective or getting emotionally involved in ways that was difficult for you, watching them go through things, counseling them at all? I mean, it's different writing and reporting on 9-year-olds than it is on, 45-year-olds who are off doing whatever they're doing, right?
Heck yeah. I mean, I had never interviewed a 10-year-old. Levi was 10 when I interviewed him for the first time, and I was terrified. I had no idea how to do it. Really, I mean, but I will say when I first got into the work, I kind of wondered if I would encounter some like missing in action parents or kids who maybe were like a little bit overexposed to the media environment and the trolling that goes with that and the emotional ride of that. But I didn't find that to be true. I never found myself pulled in a really personal, emotional way in the sense that they needed somebody. I think they do. I found, at least the ones that I got to know well, that they did have the emotional supports that they needed in their families and with their friends, and certainly with each other. This is a really tight bunch. As different as they are and as much of an age range as there is, they are really there for each other, which is a great thing to see. So they have that kind of like trench mentality. There are definitely those experiences of being like the only adult in a situation. I can tell you, interviewing one of the U.S. Youth Climate Strike organizers who was very young, 12 years old, and putting on this huge national event. I did have an experience where she just got so angry. And I think she said something like, I don't get it. I don't get it with you adults. Like, what, are you so depressed about climate change that you just can't move? You can either get out there or you can do something, or you can sit and you can watch your Netflix until you die. I just thought, wow, like that's what this looks like to a 12-year-old. And, in that moment, I think as a journalist, you always get a lot of experience with people screaming at you, but this one is like where you recognize, my first thought was, wow, I remember how hard it is to emotionally regulate when you're 12. And
Right.
my second thought was, I'm the grown up here and I'm just going to have to sit and take that and try to come up with an answer for her. And I don't know if it was a good answer or not. So there's definitely those moments where it's, I've heard kids express, like, I really feel like reporters are the only ones who are listening to me, or they talk about their grandparents who aren't believers in climate change and what it's like to have to feel like, I still love them and I want to have a relationship with them, but they don't see me. I think it's a really rough road and it's hard things to hear. Just try to do my best with it when they're yelling at me.
Well, what you said, about, watching adults watching Netflix, I mean, it really goes to, I was talking to a climate scientist named Kate Marvell, who's at NASA. She does really interesting work on climate modeling, and she talks. People out say they always ask her about hope, and about what does she have hope, and she has a great answer, which is like, she's like, I'm not interested in hope. Hope is not the right question. The question is, do you have courage? And what we need is courage, not hope. And I think that's an important distinction in talking about this. And I think that that's implicit in the comment, that you just made, that you repeated, that she made. I was wondering, like, as the Beatles and the Red Hot Chili Peppers and lots of other bands have taught us, there's a lot of tension in groups, and when you're young and doing something exciting like this. I got a little bit of that in the book. How much tension is there among this group of plaintiffs? Have there been very many moments of, like, disagreement, or I don't know. You know what I'm asking?
I have never seen that. I see a group of people that's really very tolerant of one another, and I think they worry about each other and care about each other. I see the older ones are almost maternal and parental toward the younger ones. If that tension is there, I did not witness it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they seem to be making decisions together. I've heard several of them expressed fatigue
Yeah.
with the process, but I think, you know, they're very they're supportive of each other in that.
So a couple of questions about back to where we started. So climate litigation is a really important idea that is just beginning to kind of, the courts are beginning to grapple with. You know, I think Bernie Sanders talked about wanting to sue the fossil fuel companies. This question of who's responsible and how do we hold people, you know, the companies, the governments and everybody else responsible for, you know, this sort of knowing pollution and knowingly continuing to burn fossil fuels and put, you know, the stability of our climate in danger. That's becoming an increasingly politically salient idea. So I guess, so two questions. One is, where does this, what's the future of this case? Where will this go? Give us a sense of where this might go, and how you see the larger landscape of climate litigation.
Well, I think as for this case, you know, they're asking for a full review of the Ninth Circuit. Whether they'll get that or not is unclear. We should know relatively soon. It could be any day. And then from there, it either goes back to the trial court or it becomes a Supreme Court matter if they want to appeal to the Supreme Court. And there's, I think, I've heard legal experts speculate that for this case that might lead to more bad outcomes than good, but they're going to have to consider that for themselves. I think the attorneys that have designed this case have designed it as a constitutional case to appeal to constitutionalists, whether they're appointed by a red or blue president. So I think that it's likely that they could go for it. I don't know what to expect as for the fate of this litigation, but I think litigation like it on behalf of youth is increasingly promising around the world, maybe more promising outside of the United States. So there's litigation in Mexico and Canada, Portugal, numerous other countries. And unlike the United States, many of those countries have human rights baked into their constitutions. So when they raise these kinds of questions, they are more likely to get the response that the plaintiffs are looking for. In the United States, it's really hard because your right to have a breathable air and a planet you can live on is inferred through these constitutional rights to, you know, property and liberty and life. It's pretty tenuous in that way, and there's been some extensive discussion about whether that's sufficient. As far as climate litigation overall, I mean, it's here to stay for sure, and you see a lot of fossil fuel companies having to disclose these kinds of liabilities to shareholders. So I think, you know, we will see, you know, market transition because it's just too expensive to get sued. And especially if you look at the price of natural gas and oil now, I mean, we're kind of experiencing an energy glut, and renewables are for the first time cheaper, right? So the paradigm has certainly shifted. I don't think a lot of corporations are going to be eager to take on additional these kinds of additional liabilities when they can go in a more profitable direction. So the lever of this type of litigation certainly works, and there is all kinds of litigation against fossil fuel companies, not only for impacts, but also these sorts of financial risks for shareholders. So I think more of that.
Right. And it was interesting because, you know, just to be clear about the Ninth Circuit decision, I mean, you know, you quote like people like Michael Girard at Columbia, who's, you know, very big advocate of action on climate and of legal action on climate, but who basically said this case is the wrong instrument. This is not, you know, a decision that the courts should make, right? Talk about that kind of legal quandary of this case, because, and it was even evident in the judges' decisions too, right? One of the judges, I forgot his name now, but was quite articulate, basically saying I believe in the basic idea of this case, but this is the wrong instrument to do it.
Yeah, I mean, so essentially what they say is for the courts to have to supervise the government's creation and then execution of a climate remediation plan would mean that the courts would have to supervise the executive branch in this manner for what could go on for 20 years. So that's a separation of powers issue, and that's why many legal experts say that this case can't likely proceed, and it's the reason why the Ninth Circuit struck it down for now. There was a second part to your question.
No, I think that gets it. So do you feel like, you know, as a person obviously who believes in you know, the importance of climate action and presumably believes in holding fossil fuel companies responsible in some way and the basic tenets of all this, do you feel like, does the Ninth Circuit decision that has been rendered feel sort of, to be frank, unjust to you? Does it feel, how do you feel about that decision, just as someone who's watched this closely?
Well, it's interesting to watch, you know, the way that it's been argued, right? Because what the government is essentially saying is they're saying that, you know, you can't, this is not the role for the judiciary, right? It's either Congress or it's the executive has to make changes. And if you're not happy with how that's going, well, you elect a new congressman or you elect a new president. That is a really bitter pill when the plaintiffs are not old enough to vote. So there is this question for me, okay, what's the remedy if you're the affected generation, you're younger than 18, you're gonna grow up, you're gonna solve all these problems and you're gonna pay the bill. And you have absolutely nothing. I mean, that's essentially the message to young people then, is like, if the judiciary doesn't intercede, then there's nothing that young people can do until they're old enough to vote. You know, is it fair by rule of law? Sure, but ethically and morally, we don't have that kind of time, right?
Right. Exactly. So I just want to encourage anyone who's watching and listening to, if you have any questions, to put them in the chat or just ask them. I could talk to you for the next 6 hours about all this stuff, so I'm happy to keep asking questions. But if anyone, I'd really invite anyone in the audience who's listening to ask either myself or Lee anything that's on your mind.
Yes, and if you have, audience members, if you have questions and you want to ask one on camera and be part of the recording, just send a note to me or to Davith, and we'll happily add you to the queue for that. I'd love to kick off the audience question. Oh, actually, we had just got one from Madeline, so I'm going to read that and then I'll come back to mine later. Madeline says, as a young person who's been working in climate change for over 5 years, I find the issue of being taken seriously incredibly frustrating. For the governments, not just Trump and Obama, but even looking forward to a possibility of Biden, emphasis on individual actions rather than holding industry responsible, what would you suggest are other things we can do to get our voices heard? It seems like every action seems to be, quote, the wrong instrument.
Yeah, right. That's a really frustrating problem. I mean, I've heard that. You know, organizers that I've been speaking to, hopefully this is helpful, have been talking about how lately the climate movement is working in support currently of labor and also of racial justice groups. So, you know, post George Floyd, I'm sure you feel this as other organizers do, or I shouldn't presume, possibly, that it isn't the place for climate activists to upstage folks who are in the racial justice movement right now, or folks who are advocating for better protections for frontline workers in the pandemic. But what I have been hearing a lot is a lot about climate advocates working in those movements currently and building those relationships, and then assuming that given a Biden victory, 2021 becomes their year, and they're able to use those relationships to actually build coalitions that get closer to results. you know, in spite of what might be coming out of on the campaign trail, I think the campaign is really just the campaign. In the years ahead, if there's a blue victory, I think like that collective voice and just keeping on it, really, it has, if slowly, pressured certainly Democrats to the left. You know, I can remember in elections past, climate change just being like a footnote. I think now climate change is being taken much more seriously, and that's going to be increasingly true. And so, you know, props to you for your work. And I think just, you know, keep at it and do what you can. I will say I hear a lot of people talking about direct action as well, and we're seeing more of that kind of thing.
And I if I can add an interesting, first of all, I want to say that's a great question that Madeline asked, but also talking about direct action, your book ends basically with direct action, right? I mean, you talk about that just a little bit. I mean, that's an interesting way for you to end this book, basically, you know, saying, you don't say this explicitly, I don't think, but I mean, you're talking about the importance of direct action, and then maybe this case is not, you know, the ultimate instrument for this.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, if the system won't change and the system needs to change, then people start working outside the system for change. And I think, you know, some of the Juliana plaintiffs expressed that view at points, and certainly we see its effectiveness, right? If you look to Europe with the effectiveness of Extinction Rebellion, it's hard to argue that if more people are in the streets, that wouldn't work. And certainly the US climate strikes were that in some ways. Interestingly, we had a case here in Oregon, I'm in Portland, Oregon, where we had 5 people who were arrested by basically driving a dump truck of dirt onto a railroad track and planting a garden in the path of a train that was supposed to deliver infrastructure for a pipeline project, fossil fuel pipeline. And, you know, they were out like sunning themselves, they made a scarecrow, they got arrested, they videotaped themselves, and they played the video of doing this for the jury. And they didn't argue, I didn't do it. They argued, I did it, and I did it because they had to do it. And then they brought in experts to talk about years and years and years of climate advocacy work that has not been effective, and they got a hung jury. That really says something, I think, about American attitudes towards where this is all going, at the point where a jury with no experience in these issues could be convinced that it's necessary to take what would otherwise be considered illegal actions to stop the breakdown of the climate. That's monumental.
There's a wonderful question in the chat from, or actually sent to me by Ashanta. She asks, you mentioned that many, perhaps half of the plaintiffs are kids of color. Is there a sense, particularly for the plaintiffs of color, that they're fighting a dual fight, recognition of the climate issues and the ways that calls for change have and haven't been received depending on the community affected?
Hi, yeah, for sure that's there. You know, I spend some time with Jamie Butler in the case, and I think like she's a really good example. She grew up on the Navajo Nation, where they are just battling such extreme drought. It's really, really heartbreaking. And similarly, Miko Vergun, who was adopted from the Marshall Islands, advocating for the Marshallese, and Vic Parrott, whose grandparents are Garifuna, whose mom is Garifuna and comes from Honduras. You know, these are all kind of frontline communities, and they're all communities of color, and they're all facing the worst impacts of climate change. And that is very, very obvious to some of the plaintiffs, and it gets talked about a lot.
So I would love to ask, I notice both in the way adults talk about this case and the way that adults talked about kids after Parkland, there's this sort of like adult tendency to almost fetishize young activists, you know, sort of the kids are coming to save us. And is that something that the kids in this case are aware of? Are they angry about it? Like did they notice that from the adults around them, and how do they feel about it if they do?
They are very aware of it, and they're often angry about it. That is one thing that, you know, as a group, there's very little that can be said about this group of people as a group, right? They're all unique, they're very individual, but uniformly frustrated, if not angry, about those kinds of statements. They often hear, "You're our last hope," you know, "Thank God you're doing this," and it does cause them to feel like the adults in the situation are abdicating their responsibility and foisting it onto them, and that it's unfair, and that everybody needs to do their part.
So we're getting close to out of time. Jeff, do you have a last wrap-up question that you'd like to ask? Or Lee, is there sort of a last statement that you would like to leave us with for the evening?
I guess my last question kind of goes to the end of the book with the question, with the, you know, this movement towards direct action. And one of the powerful lines at the very end of the book is this sense of faith in humanity, not the courts. And there's this sense that, you know, I mean, I have this view that, you know, the climate crisis is going to have engaged with a lot of suffering, a lot of loss. It's going to be a really hard time, but we humans will sort of muddle through it in some more or less awful way, and a lot of wonderful things will come out of it, along with all of the suffering and loss, and having a sense that you know, that this is not a end of civilization catastrophe, but a civilization changing event that will have enormous consequences in sort of everyone's life. And I felt a little bit of that note at the end of your book. And I wondered about what you think, Lee, about that final idea of faith in humanity on this.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, these are such polarizing times, and very often, you know, if you try to have a conversation about climate change, you're going to run into disagreements about it, because that's the place that we are as a nation. But I find that people one-on-one are very reluctant to endanger one another in spite of all that, you know, and I did a lot of reporting in Southern Oregon this summer, where climate denial is pretty deep, and it was about a fossil fuel project that happened to infringe on people's property rights. So there you kind of had this intersection of values, and it was really interesting to talk to people about these issues. And I don't know, maybe this is kind of a final thought in some ways, but like, I think there's a big difference between being politically active and aware and being reflexively partisan. And if people, I have a lot of confidence in people's ability to be politically active and aware and put down the reflexive partisanism in these one-on-one exchanges. I think that, you know, it's easy to discover that there are a lot of shared values between people, and none of us want to see these forests burning anymore out here on the West. So I like to think that people will come together around these issues, and maybe that's naive, and I'll laugh at myself later, but that's where I am with it.
Lee, thank you so much. That's a great, I think, way to end. It's a little hope for cohesion and unity. This has been a fascinating and great event. Jeff, Lee, thank you so much. And this has been a terrific night.
Yes, thank you both.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks, audience. It was wonderful to see you all. Please join us for another great Northshire Live event coming up soon. And you can order both Jeff's and Lee's books at northshire.com. The links were in the chat and also in the email confirmations that you've gotten. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye,
See you again real soon.
Yep, bye.
Thank you all.